All right, guys. So welcome back to episode 2 of Code Like a Pro Variables. So today we're going to be talking about how we can define our variables and use them better to accomplish a couple objectives, right? We all want to be able to write software like a professional, and these are some of the items that you need to keep in mind when you're using variables, as well as defining names for variables. So what is that going to accomplish? We're going to have 3 objectives by the end of this course. You're going to write code that is more searchable, readable, and understandable. There's a lot of ubles there, but this is what our objective is here. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we're going to accomplish those objectives. Now, these are just some of them, but we're going to be diving into other things as well. We're going to talk about following language standards, limiting scope of variables. We're talking about creating new variables versus reusing them, eliminating magic numbers and magic strings and items like that in general. We're going to talk about naming variables. We'll spend a good portion of time talking about that, about choosing a name that describes what a variable does or what its purpose is, not how it does it. And then we're going to talk about what I call this relates to naming the variables, what I call the parent or significant other test. We'll dive into that in the code examples. And we're also going to talk about when we can use long names for variables and when versus short names, and some of the how we can incorporate that into our code and more. Some of the and more sections we're going to talk about is the practices that a lot of people do that we need to break, right? You're actually causing more harm than good, and those are some of the examples we're going to give. So I'm not one that really like looking at slides. I learn from the code. Let's go ahead and dive in. Might I take a moment to thank our sponsor, Dev Mountain. You can check them out at devmountain.com. Are you interested in web development? Of course you are. Are you interested in user experience design? I bet. iOS development? Probably. Salesforce development? Maybe. Software Q&A? I think so. You might check them out at devmountain.com to find out more about their wonderful courses and programs where housing is included for free. All right, so let's start with a couple different things here. Here we have a simple algorithm to return a factorial of a number. It's not important about the code. It's not important that's in JavaScript. But the important point here is there's a couple things that we can fix immediately with our variables. One, we can start following the language standards, right? This is something that's very simple and immediately going to be apparent. In JavaScript, for instance, you would never, ever have something in all caps unless you're dealing with a constant, and an actual constant, meaning it's not an object or an array that you're going to be modifying. But this is something that we need to keep in mind at the very least, because before we can get into the higher level things of, hey, we need to be able to understand how to write good variable names, is we have to just understand how to write variables. We have to write this to our standards. So we're going to use our camel case, lowercase camel case, which is the standard here, and go ahead and fix this. All right, the next thing that we need to start thinking about is, can we eliminate variables? The less variables, the better. And this is actually some code I wrote from like 3 years ago. So, don't think that, everyone writes bad code and we all improve as long as we put the effort into. But can we eliminate things? This is something that we need to start thinking about because it's rather important. And the less variables we have to maintain, the better. So in our example here, we can actually eliminate this count variable altogether. There's really no reason to have it. And you'll see here, okay, what are we doing with it? We're setting it to 0. Okay, can we eliminate it? Well, yeah, because number here, which is just a number, and this is TypeScript, right? And we're expected to return a number here, just to provide some context. But count's doing nothing. Count is doing absolutely nothing for what we need to do it here. Is it performing anything different than number? No. Then what we can do is we can just eliminate it. There's no shame in eliminating variables when needed. This is just clutter at the end of the day. You should, if you can, have as few variables as possible, because then there's less moving parts. There's less things that we have to keep track of. Now, we start looking here where we have another no at the end of the day. This is debatable, but in my opinion, we need to, num is not a descriptive enough word, and we probably shouldn't be reassigning the values either as we are going through here, as you can see, right? So we're modifying num, which is now going to break this for loop, but let's go ahead and create a variable that actually has a good name. Now, when we create a variable, we want to describe what it does or what it is, and not how it does it. A lot of times when people start getting descriptive, let me give you a very bad example of a variable name in this instance. Let total multiplications, and we'll initialize it to num. All right, total multiplications is technically true for a variable name, but it isn't what we need to do here, and it's not what we should want to do either. Yeah. So total multiplications is not a good name, and a better name is factorial total. Now, what is this? Well, it is the number that we are storing our factorials in, our total factorial. All right, now let's go ahead and set up here, and we can do it just like so. And now here we'll return our factorial total and not some random num that's coming in. Let's give another example of some bad variable names. All right, let's take a look at this function. All this function's supposed to do is return today's date. Now you'll see here we have this D, and this is a very simple function, but we have this D here, and we're creating it. Now, if we didn't know what this was, and we didn't know what this was, would we know what D is if we had a conversation? So earlier I talked about the parent or significant other test. So if I said to you, baby, what do you think variable D is, what would you say?
That don't be gross.
Okay, okay. Well, what would you say if we renamed it to, I said, hey, what do you think today's date as a variable would be?
Today's date.
Excellent. That is the significant other or parent test. You should be able to hand someone a piece of paper, and this is the title, really, at the end of the day, and it should be that readable when you get going. Let's go ahead and give some other examples. Let's give a few more examples of how we might refactor our code in a relatively clean project where we want to make it more readable and more understandable when it comes to our variable names. Here we have an algorithm that is going to take in some values, a double nested array, for when we last backed up some items. That's all we need to know about it. Now, the first thing that we can do is, what we're going to be returning back are the file IDs that we want to update. But you might be thinking, hey, we're just returning file IDs. Another way that we could to make it a little bit better is, it's actually technically we only want the ones to update. So go ahead and make that more descriptive. It's now making this function more descriptive in the process, and you have an idea of what it is you're trying to accomplish. Let's go ahead and update this like so. All right, next, one thing I talked about in the intro was that there are times to use short variable names, and there are times to use long variable names. Now, in here, when your scope is very short, meaning it's like a callback function, it's returning something, it is all right to be using short names, such as here. So we're having file IDs. All we're doing is sorting it. I personally will still do file ID, but this is an understandable situation, especially in TypeScript, where we might drop that F, put ID, and then maybe we add a type of file onto here, right? And then it's just as descriptive as before, but now we can eliminate a little bit of clutter. But in terms of short scopes of our variables, like so, this is completely fine if we wanted to shorten those a little bit. But one thing I would highly suggest is that you start using tools that are built into the language, where if you are going to iterate through an entire array, for instance, there's no reason to do a for loop like this. We're iterating through the entire array, and we have tools to make this more descriptive while still iterating through it. So let's use a for of loop, for instance, and I'll talk about how we're going to make it more descriptive. So in our for of loop, we're going to remove some variables. We're going to remove all these ugly i's, and instead we're going to replace changes I with a more descriptive word that allows us to write cleaner, more readable, searchable, and maintainable code. So how can we do this? Well, what we're going to have is a change of changes, and we could maybe let's just refactor this one piece at a time. So here we're now eliminating pieces of text here, piece by piece by piece, and it's a little bit cleaner. Now, what are we iterating through? Well, we're clearly iterating through our array of changes, which is an excellent name. And when you were talking about renaming variables, make sure that you take into consideration renaming functions and renaming parameters, because they are equally as important when you're moving forward. And we'll have a whole section on functions and parameters as well. But that's neither here nor there. But you'll notice that we have this change 0 and change 1 and change 1. And, if you're super familiar with the changes array, it may make sense. But we want to look at our code and not have to dive deeper. We want to have the simplest ways that we can do that. And we can use things in JavaScript and other languages as well, where we can give a more descriptive variable name and assignments here while making our code. So what is change 0? Change 0 is greater than last backup time. That doesn't make anything. But if we go ahead and create a const here and we say, hey, let's do we'll say const is equal to, what do we want to do? Change. We'll create a variable here. So each one of these changes are an array, and we'll do a little bit of array deconstruction, and we'll say last updated time, and we'll go ahead and also create a variable here called file ID, or updated file ID, and we'll just set this equal to change, and we have those variables. Now that we have this, we can make our code here so much more readable. Where we're saying, hey, oops, is our code, was our last updated time greater than the last backup time? That makes more sense than change 0, right? And was our updated file ID, do we already have, does our file IDs to update already include the updated file ID? If it doesn't, go ahead and add 2 file IDs to update our current file ID. Now, with just a couple changes in our logic here, not changes in our logic, changes in our structure, we have eliminated some of the floating, not floating, but index values that aren't needed, and we have instead done a little bit of array deconstructing to pass in values, and now this reads very, very clear, at least in when it talks about our variable definements. Definements was a weird word to use. One thing I wanted to say is don't be afraid to change variable names as well. So the thing you have to remember when you're writing code is that it's always changing, right? New features are coming out, updates are coming out, and even just sitting here, I was thinking about this variable name a little bit, and I was going to move on to the next section, but I was thinking, this isn't even completely correct. It's not that file IDs we want to update. We want to back up files. That's what we're trying to get here. Now, we are storing file IDs in there, but what is it we're trying to accomplish? We are trying to back up files. And so file IDs to back up. We're not trying to update anything. And so these are the IDs to back it up. So don't be afraid to jump in and change this. And if you dive into the code and the variable names are bad, or the variable names have slightly changed, don't be afraid to go and change it. A lot of times people are, especially if it's code they didn't originally write. One thing that people do all the time, especially when they're getting started with object-oriented programming, is they start prefixing property names with the name of the class. And it's a really bad item. What I mean by that is, say we have this cat class, and it is our friend's cat. That's whose cat it is. And we want to update our friend's cat's age, so they just had a birthday. You would have properties, which essentially are variables at the end of the day of an object, say, hey, cat age is now 10. And then our friend's cat dot name, we're updating his name to be Tito. We do not need to prefix property names in our classes, so we can go ahead and just remove that like so. This is something that people do all the time. And I've been guilty of this as well, so don't think most of the things that I'm telling you are things that I've done and learned from. There's no reason to prefix these items. We have IntelliSense. We can hover over. We can see the type. We can look through the code. All it does is create clutter and confusion. So when you're dealing with objects, you don't want to be doing that. Another thing to keep in mind is when you have constants, when you have variables, older developers, although it's not too common nowadays, will use what's called Hungarian notation, where essentially you're going to include the type in your item. So let's say we have a type here, and I remember our file IDs. So we do file IDs, and then you would include number at the end or at the beginning, depending on the convention. But this is essentially Hungarian notation. Now, this is a very bad practice and something that I encourage you not to do. For one, if you're using TypeScript, you don't need to. And most programming languages that is not JavaScript will have a type that you can assign to it. And two, what else could file IDs be? It could be a string, I guess. It could be a number, but this adds clutter and unnecessary. And it could be multiple things. So what if file IDs is actually a dynamic type? And so what do we get? A number and string, and sometimes it's a string number. What do? All we're doing is adding confusion to our code. So it's avoid Hungarian notation as much as possible. All right, one thing that you need to avoid as well are what we call magic numbers and strings, for that matter. But that's a little bit different. Magic strings refers to passing in a key into an object that you haven't defined. You typically want to avoid that. But here, magic numbers refers to passing in numbers that apparently came out of nowhere with no context, right? So here you'll see 63,667 and 0.4447. Do you know what this is? I do, just because I had recently looked at it, but it took me a second to figure it out. This is actually the Earth radius to figure out the orbital period. So let's go ahead and provide context, and we'll make this a big old constant in this case, in all caps, and we're going to set it equal to this value. Now we have a much better idea what this is, and we can go ahead and pass in Earth radius. Actually, I don't really like that. We're gonna do it like this. If I was doing a global constant, I might have it like that. But either way, so we have Earth radius here, and then what is this big old number? Well, it's going to be the gravitational metric. We'll do grav metric and set it equal to this, and insert grav metric here. Now our code is much more readable. We do have more variables, and that's all right, but it's more readable, which is the objective here. So avoid magic numbers when at all possible. Another thing to keep in mind when working with variables is you want to limit the scope to be as small as possible. And what I mean by that is, here we have this beginner project that we'll be refactoring, or we did refactor in an upcoming linter video. But we have a ton of global variables. Typically you want to avoid global variables if at all possible. And when you can, such as like this answer button's used in toSpot, it's used in this function here. Same thing with only used in this function. Same thing I would imagine with this one and with this one. So what we can do is we can go ahead and take this, jump down to here, and put it into our where it belongs, which is in a more local scope to where it's at. The idea here with your variables is you want to keep them as close to where they need to exist, because it's going to provide the most context for how much they are useful, right? So you typically want to avoid the global scope if you can, and put variables in the most limited scope possible so that you can get that additional context. Another variable naming to consider is when working with Booleans specifically, there is a is for present tense or has for past tense in terms of the naming convention. This sort of lets you flag it out here, and we can, typically we don't ever want to put the variable types in here if we can avoid it. So we could do something like this, where instead of is box Boolean, is box, meaning it is a box or it is not a box, or if you prefer, the past tense has box or does not have box in that sense. The only thing I will say that when you are naming this, keep it singular, because part of our objective here is to make items readable and pronounceable. So isBox would be how I would go about it typically for me in the present tense. So we can go ahead and replace box boolean with isBox everywhere and clean that up a little bit. So that's something to keep in mind when working with naming for Boolean variables. Now this is a little bit of a personal preference, I would say, but one thing for variables is default parameters. A lot of times you'll see people use this, or if we have a invalid value here, a falsy value, but I would argue that if you need a default value for your parameters, they should be, which essentially are variables at the end of the day, right? We're passing data. Anything that passes data, we're considering a variable at this point. But we instead want to have this value here. The reason for it is, it's its default value. Thus, you can assign it. The only caveat to that is that it works slightly different than our OR operator. So this will only assign a default value if it is actually undefined, while here it'll do it for any falsy value. So keep that in mind, but in general you want to, unless you have a good reason, want to put it in your default parameters, because it's in one location, one place to look at, and it's in my opinion a little bit cleaner than using the OR operator. So Chigozi A says, why do bootcamps only teach web development and not object-oriented programming like many universities? So this is sort of a common question, and web development, the majority of jobs are in web development. That's not to say that there aren't a ton of jobs in other things. And your objective when you go to a bootcamp is to get skills which will land you a role in the workplace. Now, that's not to say that you're not going to be doing object-oriented programming. You're more so referring to the fact that they're going to be teaching you things like Java and C# instead of JavaScript. And that, yes, that's true, because JavaScript's more for web dev. But you will be learning object-oriented programming as you move forward, especially if you pick up a framework like Angular, where everything is a class. You start using TypeScript, and you start working with dependency injection. But a lot of those concepts aren't crucial for boot camps to get you out and get you going into the workplace. So that's why. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. If you like this series and you want to learn more on your own, might I recommend the book Clean Code. I have an affiliate link in the description as well as in the card that you can click and check it out. I highly recommend it. I'll be doing a book review about it shortly. Check it out. Bye guys, and see you next time.